Corporate Board Member presents an informational webcast. On this edition, engaging with institutional investors and proxy advisory firms. With T.K. Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and John Siemann, President and Partner, Phoenix Advisory Partners.
Welcome. My name is T.K. Kerstetter, and I'm the President of Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this board informational webcast. We're going to be talking about engaging institutional investors and proxy advisory firms, and it's my pleasure to welcome John Siemann, who's the President and Founder of Phoenix Advisory Partners, which is a proxy advisor and someone that consults in this area of proxy, all the proxy happenings, and that's no small issue these days, is it, John?
No, it's not, TK. It's been quite a change over the past decade from the way things have evolved now. This is a very lively landscape that I think most managements and most board members find themselves on.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of hand-wringing around this communication and what's happening with the votes, particularly when you look at the power of the vote now, because in the now you have Proxy 452, which means that the brokers can't vote on the discretionary shares on some of the proxy issues, and you have the majority voting, which is big. Well, all of a sudden now you have this fear on a board level of people not being reelected. That's no small fear, so I would suspect that there is hand-wringing. And
well, there should be. This has been, as I said, quite a change over the last 20 years, from a time when the annual meeting was the quote-unquote annual meeting that was a non-event, and annual meetings are anything but routine. Institutional shareholders have made the focus of their interest accountability of board members, and virtually every measure that comes to a vote now on the ballot is a referendum that casts some weight on whether or not the holders of the company think the board is acting in an accountable way.
Let's cut right to the chase and sort of talk about what companies should be doing relative to this communication, and then what can they expect?
Companies need to take a look at their institutional shareholders and their overall shareholder base and understand who really is going to be having the influence of voting the shares. Are their institutional holders going to be following the recommendation of a proxy advisory firm, or are they going to be using their own internal policies to make a decision? Over the last 5 years, a significant number of institutional holders have moved away and now use their own guidelines, and that's good for corporate issuers because it allows these institutions to make their decisions on a case-by-case basis and a company-by-company basis. But it is an imperative that each issuer understand when they look at their shareholders and say, well, gee, I'm 70% held by institutions, is that of that 70% is 30% going to follow a proxy advisory firm, or is 10% going to follow them? Because that'll determine the strategies you use, the outreach that you use, who you talk to, what you say. And I really think that's one of the key issues now, is that I think boards are recognizing that there's a need now to almost begin to tailor what they put on in the proxy ahead of time based on what their shareholders are going to allow them to do, rather than, let's say, 10 years ago, where boards acted in very much their own self-contained world, made decisions, and then put them on the ballot and waited for the shareholders to respond. It's a very different dynamic now.
Well, when you say proxy advisory firms, in essence, the 900-pound gorilla in the room is ISS. But
the dreaded I word, ISS.
Well, but what's interesting is that an ISS recommendation for a no vote is not the end of the world.
Absolutely not. Over the past 3 years, ISS has seen a significant erosion in its influence over institutional shareholders. I know many companies feel that, well, all they have to do is get in alignment with the ISS position and they are on safe ground. The fact of the matter is that at most companies, the actual influence of ISS is probably somewhere between 8 and 12% of the outstanding shares. So I think one of the pitfalls to avoid is simply to say, well, I'm going to craft my actions to satisfy ISS. I think that's both very frustrating because of the way ISS policies keep ratcheting up every year and the restrictions they put on boards, but it also doesn't guarantee success. I think say on pay vote is probably the clearest example, the ones that happened in 2011. There were probably, I think the number slightly less than 400 companies that generated a less than 75% vote, which in this new environment is considered the trigger for being successful or not successful. And of those, more than 2/3 actually generated a yes vote from ISS in favor, and yet they still generated those poor votes because other institutions that don't follow those ISS guidelines were willing to vote against. So it's important to know your shareholders. I think that confirms that point probably better than anything else.
It was interesting, recently we saw where Blackrock sent out a communique to about 600 of their companies where they said, we're open to have you contact us. That's almost like a new paradigm where here's an institutional investor that is receptive when you have this almost check the box kind of theory at ISS, and then you have this openness. So is that a perfect example?
And that's a perfect example, and I think that's what is encouraging, or what should be encouraging for most managements and boards, is the fact that increasingly the larger institutions like the Blackrocks and the Fidelities and the Wellingtons and the Vanguards and the Capital Re's are all open to having these discussions, and they're all willing to listen to the particular case that any company may have as to why they may have taken certain measures. It's the exact opposite of the check-the-box approach of someone like an ISS. So that while oftentimes some advisors will say, well, you need to go meet with ISS, going to meet with ISS can be valuable from an educational sense in you're getting a better understanding of their principles and their guidelines. But they are not going to waver or fluctuate from those guidelines in any way, shape, or form, irrespective of whatever your particular situation is. It's very much a check-the-box approach for folks like that.
So if somebody said to you, came to you and said, can I mitigate or minimize the activism part by having an outreach program or something like that, what would your recommendation back be?
The answer there is absolutely, and I think a growing number of companies are recognizing that and implementing those kind of programs. I know I spoke with the folks at Capital Re who said that as briefly as 2 years ago, they had less than 100 companies that were involved in outreach to them. This past year, 2011, that number had increased to over 1,000. That we're now opening up dialogue with them, looking to have meetings, looking to have conversations to discuss various items on their ballot. And I think that really is the key now that certainly many of the large caps have moved in that direction, but increasingly the mid caps are moving there as well, because they recognize that as the focus of activists increasingly gets turned on them, they want to be able to explain to their larger holders again, the uniqueness, let's say, of certain situations that they may have.
And we know we're going to see that this proxy season where majority voting and those start to trickle down to mid-caps and small caps, right?
The mid-caps who may have lived in a sort of wonderful bliss for the past few years are now squarely moving into the battle zone and are going to be caught up in this. So I think, but that awareness is what's encouraging to me, at least, is that awareness seems to be out there within the universe. Many of our mid-cap clients are proactively getting involved in doing this.
We mentioned the most visible, which is the say on pay part of that, and there's a lot of discussion of what will be, sort of people felt year one wasn't as bad as it potentially could have been. You hear from the institutional investors that we were taking it easy. At the same time, the companies had to learn so much more about what was acceptable and what wasn't. So what's your prediction for say on pay this coming season, knowing that we've lived one already?
many of the companies that got poor votes in 2011 are taking the time and making the effort to improve the areas that were problematic, and you're going to see their votes improve dramatically. And at the first couple of votes, we've already seen that. Two of the companies that actually failed Say on Pay who have early meetings have already had their votes, and they've gone from votes in the 40% range last year to votes in the 80 and 90% range now. Conversely, though, where I think the pitfall comes in is that a lot of companies who last year did okay, they did in the 80s or they did in the 90% range, and are fairly comfortable, are going to be blindsided this year by either some unique situations or by, quite frankly, a more thorough examination of their compensation by people who last year didn't. I mean, I'll tell tales out of school. There's one major institutional investor who I was on a panel with who flat out said that they didn't have the staff to review everyone's say-on-pay proposal. At best, they reviewed 1 in 3, and the other 2 simply got a yes, but were never even looked at. This year, they've got more staff. They're going to look at them, and so there could be some very unpleasant surprises there.
Well, so nobody should sit on their laurels from last year then.
No, I think the list of the names are going to change. The results will stay the same, but the names will change.
You've always been a great visionary whenever you and I have had the chance to talk about this, so I'm going to put you in that position again because I want to ask you, what are things that maybe have not been as prominent in the past that you can look forward to in the future? 2012
is going to be a year of trial balloon for various proxy access proposals. Proxy access is not going away because it wasn't implemented through Dodd-Frank. A number of activists are committed enough to it that they will, and if you've noticed, there's 5 different variations on the proposal this year already on shareholder proposals. That's not a coincidence. They are deliberately being set up to see what's going to be amenable to the larger institutions and what's going too far. So you'll see that the ownership levels vary from 1% to 5%. The amount of time to own the stock varies from 1 month to 3 years. And at the end of the process, at the end of the 2012 proxy season, the activists will have a much clearer idea over what they can put forward in 2013. But I also think that there's going to be other issues as well. Board diversity is an issue that a number of the state pension funds, again, are pushing now, where they're looking to mandate a certain kind of diversity. It's not going to be enough to simply say, well, we look for the best qualified candidates. Some of the activists are clearly looking to even remove auditors as a routine matter so that there'll be no routine items on the ballot. For some companies, that could make getting a quorum a little bit more of an issue. And I think overall for directors, there's going to be much more of a willingness now to apply against votes to people outside the comp committee. Right now, certainly for 2012, the comp committee really is the group that's wearing the bullseye. I think going forward, it's increasingly going to be the nominating and governance committee. I think they're going to be targeted for any measures that certain institutions feel that boards don't take, whether it be replacing a certain member who gets a fairly high against or withhold vote, or whether it means not rotating auditors. I mean, there's a laundry list of items that different activists feel are grounds to go after either the chairman or the entire nominating and governance committee. So that's going to be the new area where everyone's going to have a bullseye is what it's going to come down to.
Well, there's no question that this will be a spirited proxy season, and I'm sure that will keep people like yourself hopping pretty good on that. So, John, I want to thank you. As usual, you do a great job. We've only been able to touch the surface on this topic, but I think it will be helpful to viewers at least to get this insight. And so that will conclude this informational webcast. We hope you found it beneficial, and we'll look forward to bringing you others in the future. Thanks for joining us.
John Siemann can be reached at jseamann@phoenixadvisorypartners.com. This has been a presentation of Corporate Board Member at NYSE Euronext Company.